Hello, I'm Susan Feller, the curator for Stories Are Made, Loop by Loop. And in this series, I'm working with each of the artists individually and having a nice conversation. Today, we have Elizabeth Miller from Maine. And in questions that have come up is why did I select each of the artists or their work? In Beth's case, we were in a small group online during COVID, so we got to know each other and our processes. Her work is included in Karen Miller's The Art of Mothering book, and one of the pieces was the beginning for what I selected. She's worked on another one, so there are two in the collection. And what I also like about Elizabeth's approach to designing is that she's a writer. So writing is extremely important, thinking through, and as the theme for the show is, her stories are made, spending the time pulling those loops. So if you'd like to introduce yourself by sharing some images and telling us more about your story, we'd love to hear it.
Sure. So let me just hit share screen here. So yes, my name is Elizabeth Miller, and I'm a fiber artist and writer here in Maine. And I am very, very influenced in my work by the natural environment around me. And it's not limited to Maine. It's also pretty comprehensive of the entire North Atlantic region. I'm very inspired by the landscapes here, by the ocean, by the seafaring culture, by the mountains, all of that. And so it does get reflected in my work. It's also important to know that some of my work deals with an upbringing that was somewhat difficult in the mid-Atlantic. And coming to Maine to my grandparents' home on Little Sebago Lake was very, very important to me as a place of solace and a place of healing. And so we're going to see some of that as we go through these pieces. I just finished this one. This one is just called Maine Winter Sunset. And it's I was in a situation where I was going out my backyard in Paris, Maine, to feed my chickens actually, and I was just stopped in my tracks by this beautiful, incredible sunset that was unfolding in front of me. And I noticed that the tree line was very contrasted with a brilliant sky, which I assure you looked exactly like this. And I thought to myself, how can I capture this in fiber? But it was kind of an emotional moment for me because I am always just overwhelmed by the beauty of nature here. And so this was the result. I used a lot of different materials in the sky to try to capture the texture and the variation that I was seeing in the cloud formations. And I wanted the foreground snow to be nice and smooth. And so that's why I chose to use just traditional um, directional rug hooking for that part. And when I went to do the dark tree line, I discovered that it was going to be very, very difficult to hook that in its almost monochromatic way and still get the tree trunks differentiated. So I ended up doing applique with a really, really deep purple fabric that I had on hand. It's wool. And then I was lucky enough to find in my local yarn store a yarn that would be great for the fly stitching. And because I didn't want the fly stitching to stick out, but I did want it to add texture. So that's that's the story on that piece. This is another landscape. I did this landscape some years ago. It appeared in Rug Hooking magazine, and um, the point of the article that I wrote for Rug Hooking magazine for this was alternative techniques. So you can see there is some chain stitching, there's some felting, there's some French knotting, that kind of thing. But this is a scene that I pass in Paris, Maine almost every day when I'm walking my dogs. And what I wanted out of this piece was to really look closely at the weathered fence rail, at the stone wall, at the bittersweet vines, and at the white mountains in the distance, and really kind of see it in a way that I was often blowing off just in the everyday task of walking my dogs. I did try to use a lot of straight line hooking in the sky and in the fence rails to contrast against the flow of the rock wall and the mountains and all of that. But this is just another sort of representational landscape. This piece I made for Making Magazine some years ago, and the prompt was dusk. And I, of course, immediately thought of the tide pools on the rock ledges that I see in Maine and Nova Scotia, and how they look at dusk and how purple they are and how reflective they are. But I wanted to capture the depth of these pools and their different layers in the places where the stratified rock captures the light when the sun is setting. And so I used a lot of um, different widths, different textures, different materials. There's some hand torn in here that's like over a half an inch wide, and then there's some really small things. And I also used beads and shells and things like that to embellish it. But I think what I also wanted to do was do something that was more abstract, like an abstract interpretation of nature, and not just do representational work, um, as I had done and as you saw with the other two landscapes. So this piece is called Breaking the Cycle. This is in the Stories Are Made Loop by Loop exhibit. And this is kind of where my writing sort of comes in. Often when I'm designing, I really do see words as well as images. Words come to me. I keep a journal. Sometimes my journal entries become images. Sometimes it's the other way around. I'll get an image and then I'll want to kind of write it out, because writing is almost my first medium, even before visual art. So this was made for Karen Miller's book, The Art of Mothering. And what I wanted to represent in this was my work as a mom and trying to break intergenerational cycles of dysfunction and trauma in my own history. And so my kids, these are my four sons, they are kind of moving up this stairwell of these experiences that I had while I was raising them. There was anxiety, there was personal failure, but there was also self-awareness. There was some level of redemption, although as I watch my boys parent, I see them moving this healing process even further than I was able to. But I wanted to show them looking out onto the world. And I feel like this trauma-based healing work is um, is kind of the next level of work from my nature work. The nature work I'm always going to do, but nature has been a solace because of these life experiences. And now I feel like I'm diving more into my life experiences and representing those visually as well. And in this piece, I know sometimes people don't see it right away, but there are two profiles on either end, and those just represent a parent looking on as their children actually take things one step further and do better than they did. So this piece is related. This piece is called Bring It Up Alive. This is also in Stories Are Made Loop by Loop. And again, the imagery is very much around my place of safety as a child on the lake in Maine where my grandparents had their cabin. And I actually confronted my younger self. This is a self-portrait of me when I was much younger, maybe teenager, young 20s. And I kind of approached this in the mode of reparenting myself. I really spent time with myself as I hooked this piece and had a lot of time to think. And the diving loon represents kind of going back and bringing up whatever is that you need to bring up as a healing person, and bringing it up live and vibrant and working with it. So that's what the loon represents. The four swirls on her face and throat represent just a little nod to my four sons, which are the story of my family moving forward. And I also just stitched four random beads on this piece. My work sometimes has symbolism in multiples of four, and it's about my family of procreation. So these are the pieces that I'm going to be working on next. The one on the left is called Prey, Prey, and it's a continuation of Bring It Up Alive. It's a loon in a posture of both wrestling and rising. She is wrestling this prey that she's brought up alive out of the lake, but she's rising up. And one of the things about my work is I have no idea what it's going to look like at the end. So all I know about this piece is that I do want to make the sky and the water kind of mirror the way I handled it in Bring It Up Alive. But my pieces evolve. I don't color plan. I don't do a lot of planning. They just kind of happen as they happen. And then the one to the right, I've just put on linen. The one to the right is called Don't Play Small. And that one again is an extension of this trauma and healing work. And it's a little fiercer. It's bringing to the fore that for any of us who may have made ourselves invisible as a survival tactic, or made ourselves invisible for any reason at all, it's a reminder that it is okay to be visible, and it is okay not to play small. So that's it.
Well, that was a great overview and deep dive into some of your background. If you'd like to stop sharing, we'll both come on screen again. And as in all the interviews, I've made a couple questions or observations. One, and the purpose being that I know everyone's going to go back and look at these again because they heard your voice, and there's a couple of the things that I want them to look at again, or a little deeper conversation. You have been innovative with your materials and your techniques in all of your pieces, adding that little bit of beading or the multitude of different materials for widths and texture and lighting. But I want people to see in that bittersweet landscape, to look at that background of the tree line just as importantly as how you had worked the feathering stitches in the first piece. You needle felted over.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was a wonderful way of adding all that little wonderful, very, very distant fall coloring in those trees. So I think that was a great problem solving.
And it was problem solving, because when I hooked the trees, I realized how kind of stark they looked. I wanted that tree line to be soft.
Mhm.
And when I hooked the vertical, like, birches, it was too sharp. And it was drawing the eye. So
Mhm.
I needed to soften it and cover it a little bit.
Well, that worked out really well. Instead of going to such a fine little tiny yarns or something and fussy hooking it in.
Yeah,
I,
which is
I
not
no,
my style.
no, it was turned out really well and natural and organic. So that's something to look at. And I want to also just emphasize the fact that you, as you said in the last slide, these are two pieces. Okay, I've got them on backing one of them. It's working maybe as a pair, or flowing. So maybe the palette will be similar, but if everyone looks at your social media, I really love the fact that your process goes up. And as you said, there's problem solving all the time. Um, and the end result we certainly enjoy, but I think it's the innovative work that you do. The only part that, of course, your slides aren't going to show is, why don't you talk a little about how that writing process is so important? And there's a couple books. There's one done and one under contract. We'll put it that way.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's another way of designing.
It is. And, I know some artists have a very structured practice where they journal first and then they create the images around the words. And for me, it's more of like, it's more serendipitous, it's more of a flow. Like, I might I might be, hiking or at the ocean or something, or I might have an experience with my family, and the words will just come to me. And I do find that it's helpful to write them down, because if I don't write them down in that moment or make some kind of note of them, I might lose the specificity. It's a hard word to say. I might lose the specificity of what I was feeling or experiencing at that moment. So, like, I just keep like something like this, or there's an even smaller one in my purse or my backpack, and I will write it down. And sometimes I'll make a little sketch that goes with it, but sometimes I won't, and I just will hold the image. And then other times, like, the image will come first. I'll do a sketch and then I'll say, "Oh, this really reminds me of," um, I have writers that have influenced me too, like Henry David Thoreau or Stuart Kestenbaum, who is a poet who was the Maine Poet Laureate for a while, and I'll be reminded of some of their words and want to incorporate that feeling into the piece. I feel like uh, breaking the cycle actually has the words hooked into it. So sometimes I do that. I have pieces with words hooked into them. But like Bring It Up Alive was really, I think I thought about that phrase first. Like, when you're on a healing journey, you've got to bring it up, and you've got to bring it up in a way that is not academic. It's got to be living. You've got to be maybe revisiting those feelings and processing them as now an adult versus how you were processing them as a child in that situation. And so from there, that's where I kind of thought about like the decades that I've been watching loons
Mhm.
plunge themselves underwater and come up many yards away with something in their mouth. And so I don't really have, it's an organic process that would be hard for me to like apply a step by step to.
Well, I think that's important for people to realize that other mediums can influence or be influenced by totally flipping out. So you don't just write, you're not just a writer, but in that writing process, there are designs that you are able to work. And as you're working on them, you're working on writing again, or it's that resolution. And it takes me back to a Maine artist, Marguerite Zorak, who did textile work, even though she was an oil painter and known for that and the sculpting work that her husband did. But in doing that, I've experienced it also working in print work or camera photography, and then going back just to explore something so different. Writing is verbal and it's written, and then the viewer reads it and absorbs it. In our visual work, your story is right there on the wall in our cases. And I question people in the catalog to look at the artwork and see what story can they make from it first before they read each artist's stories. So
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
yeah, I think that's also a fun way. And it's also that scary way for an artist. You turn it out to the world and you don't know what someone else is looking at it.
It's scary, but at the same time, I really love that. I experienced that a little bit with the sunset landscape
Mhm.
because I just hung it in a gallery in Lewiston, Maine, and I had a couple of people talk to me about what they saw and why it was emotional for them to see it. And I was blown away. I loved it. I loved that a lot of their takes were different than anything that I had already thought of.
I think that's the fun part about as we are doing, showing our hooked work outside of that community of rock
Yes.
hookers. So we're not talking about techniques or knowing no one's looking at our work and saying, oh, look at the yarns and whatever that you use. They're looking at it because it's art on the wall and what is it doing for them and how are they responding? Well, thank you very much. We will have as a last slide in this interview, your contact information. And as I do for all of our interviews, I encourage everyone to start following Elizabeth Miller at North Atlantic Fiber Arts.
Thank you so much.